Hello, my friend. Thank you so much for joining me for this week's episode on As It Relates to Podcasting. Today, we are talking all about content creation tips with my friend, Lloyd George, and we have such a great conversation in store for you. Before we get into our conversation, I want to just highlight and share with you that I've launched a new $11 membership, $11 a month membership. And this membership gives you all of the tools and all of the resources that you need to start your podcast, manage your podcast, grow your show, secure brand deals, brand partnerships, and anything in between. There's also a community aspect to it as well. There's a community on Discord that is so amazing and just so soul fulfilling. So I definitely invite you to check out the link to that in the show notes below. And please message me if you have any questions at all. So let's get into today's conversation with Lloyd. We're talking about the dynamic world of content creation, and we're talking about the clash, if you want to call it that, between podcasting and YouTube. We're talking about listener habits. We're talking about how the landscape is evolving and how it's reshaping in a different way and redefining the way that we consume audio and video content. There is so much value packed in here. I know you're going to love it. So if you do, be sure to leave a rating and review of the show so I can hear and see how much you love our conversations. Be sure to check out that membership. The link is in the show notes below. And let's get into today's conversation. Lloyd, welcome to part 2 of our time together. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me. I feel like last time we got to talk about a lot. I'm excited to keep the convo going, so I'm excited to be here.
I know, me too. I'm really excited. I loved our first conversation, and this is a caveat, I think, for people who are creating. You know what? It falls into what we're talking about today. A lot of times people talk about like how they're setting up their podcasts and their episodes and questions and all that kind of stuff and like the prep work that you do before a podcast. And I think with this podcast in particular, I feel like I'm pretty lucky because I only bring on people that I trust onto this show. And because it's a big amount of space, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like we're doing like 4 to 5 episodes a month. Like I want to make sure that I know who the person is and that I resonate with their message and vice versa, because I know that my audience will too. I don't really do a whole lot of prep for these episodes, but I'll put like, bullet point ideas of like things that I think I'd like to hit on and touch on and whatever, as you would. And it just went in such a beautiful way. So if you haven't listened to the first episode, please do.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like we went a bit crazy. I was a bit excited about I feel like when I haven't spoken to people about this stuff in a long time and then we talk, it just feels like,
yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. Which is crazy because you actually did just get back from VidCon. So like, you think that you'd be like all creatored out, but I guess maybe you're just more inspired. I don't know.
I was ironically the only podcast person I met at VidCon. Like I didn't meet any other podcast. I don't even think I met another creator with a podcast.
What?
So yeah, I know. Bizarre.
Very bizarre, but very interesting to me because that is what most people do. But maybe I'm like so like blinders on in the podcasting space that I'm like,
yeah,
you know what I mean?
You assume everyone has a podcast already.
Yeah. And I'm like, what do you mean
same.
You don't have a podcast? Like everyone has a podcast now,
Yeah, same. I did run into a lot of creators that said they wanted to start a podcast, but I feel like the bulk majority of people I met were like YouTube people, all in through, in and out.
Which is interesting too, because being YouTube and then starting a podcast, they're different platforms, like they're different mediums, but I think 1,000%. There's definitely ways to create that synergy. But one of my clients earlier on this year still has an amazing YouTube channel, and fitting the podcast into her YouTube strategy was interesting because it's different.
Yeah. And let's talk about that. I know I feel like this is kind of in line with what we're talking about. Do you, I feel like in the world of podcasting, there are some people that feel how you feel, which is that hey, podcasting is one thing, having a video channel, a YouTube channel, even if you are doing interviews, that's a completely separate thing. There is no RSS feed, so that's not a podcast. And then other people just kind of group it all into one. How do you feel about this whole situation?
I mean, I'm that person that takes my podcast and puts it on YouTube. So I feel like you can use the content, you can repurpose it, but I feel like if you're going to do a video podcast on YouTube, you need to edit it. You need to have things that are engaging. You need to zoom in, you need to zoom out. You need to know when your people drop off typically so that you can do something to get them to go back in. So I think it takes a lot more strategizing to make the podcast something that someone will sit down and listen to. But here's the thing too, and you tell me what you think about this. Our conversations in this series are very conversational. Like we're literally just shooting the shit back and forth. Some podcasts are very interview based, question, answer. So it's like, what is going to make someone sit down and watch your entire YouTube video? And then on the flip side of that, I think that the audiences for each are completely different too. Like someone who watches YouTube videos probably consumes podcast content differently.
Yeah, 1000%. I agree. Gosh, I was really hoping you were going to say like the opposite of that, because we haven't got into one single argument this entire last series. And I love, like, that's my favorite thing about podcasting. I love like when people say like the opposite thing I believe. Sometimes, honestly, if they say something I do believe, I'll just disagree just so we could like argue.
That's
but that will
okay,
come
I
soon.
say the opposite. I'm saying the opposite.
I do agree. I agree that like people, like the way people that consume podcasts. I was talking to someone that's like I'd say like a podcast exec, and they were saying like a really big podcast on YouTube wasn't a podcast. And I'm not going to say that podcast name, but they were like, that's not a podcast. They were on YouTube first before they even had like an RSS or on Apple or whatever. They just did. And they're like a huge podcast, like millions of downloads per episode.
Do I know it? I know it.
I'm sure you definitely know it.
Okay.
And so I was just kind of caught off guard because they were saying like, that's not a podcast. And I hate all these YouTube channels that call themselves podcasts. And it just had me thinking like, what do I define as like a podcast?
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And so I agree with your perspective where it's like whether it is like it has RSS, doesn't, like, does it really matter? It's like we're all going to call it a podcast. My mom thinks it's a podcast. my friends think it's a podcast. Like, then it's a podcast, right? Like we don't have to be that meticulous about it. I think like 3 years from now, I don't even know that there'll be like a big difference. Like I think if you're just interviewing people on YouTube and you don't even have like a RSS on Apple or Spotify or anywhere, we're still going to say that's a podcast.
I don't even think that there's a huge difference now, in my opinion. Like you have a show, because here's the biggest like shift that I've seen over the last few months specifically. People are like, cool, having the audio side of the podcast is great and all, but I want to have a show. Do you know how many times a day I hear, I want to be Oprah? And I'm like, okay, I love that for you. And also only Oprah is Oprah. So why don't you be you? No, I'm just kidding.
Sound advice.
We're done here.
Very high bar. That is a very good point. That like, I feel like same thing. Like I run into lots of people that never say like my end goal is to have a podcast. It's always like, I want to have like a show, just like Oprah did on TV. Yeah. And I think that's like cool. I think that's admirable. I do think like another like controversial left take, I wonder if the shows like on TV in the way that we remember them are kind of like gone, that's just like not going to be a thing anymore. And I can't think like in recent years, I can't think of someone that has been able to do that has been able to like say like, I have a show that is big enough that comes on TV that is, I know at 4 p.m. every single day, I'm captivating millions of people. I can't think of anyone yet.
You know what's interesting with that? And I have to like follow up on this because I'm not 100% sure whatever happened to it. Do you ever listen to The School of Greatness with Lewis Howes?
Yes.
He got a TV deal for his show. Like an actual like TV deal. And so, I mean, I don't know if it's live. Like, I don't know if it's on air, if you will.
Yeah.
But I think that's really interesting. And it really begs the question of like, do podcasts then potentially turn into like a Netflix series? Because so I'll give you an example. Like one of my clients and I, she has a podcast. She interviews people virtually. The topic is really, really cool. It's really interesting. Her show does really well. I won't say what it is because it's the only one in my roster that is like this and I don't want to call her out. And I don't want to share her secrets either of what we're doing and what we're planning. But so one thing that we've been talking about is scrapping virtual altogether, which you and I were talking about how you barely do virtual anymore. So scrapping that, doing everything on location at different places. So things that we would plan in advance, and then creating 10 episode series for each particular topic that we're talking about. That gives me like Anthony Bourdain vibes. You know what I mean? Like that gives me like creating a series and like making it something that people will binge and like want to tune into.
Yeah, 1000%. I love that. And I feel like I've been seeing like a few creators do that on YouTube, like Two Quick Thoughts, like, and it's about the same group. So there's like this group called Colin and Samir. So on the Colin and Samir podcast, they were interviewing Tim Ferriss last week. And one of the things he said specifically, I think he uses the example of Oprah, but one of the things he says is like there's no more celebrities in the way that we remember them. And so this idea of there being like one Oprah and then millions of people consuming that content every single day, I think most people now don't just view themselves as consumers, but view themselves as the creator. Like we all want to be the Oprah. And so by nature, we're all creating content. And so the likelihood of there being like one person that rises out of that significantly enough to have, let's just say 100 million followers is just unlikely. It's more likely that there'll be like 100 different people that have 100,000 followers all in our micro niches or whatever. And so as we think about sort of like this idea of like creating content, that's what I think like the future looks like. I think there's just going to be like more creators and less like megastars. Even with like large TV shows, it's like, I don't know that there'll be like 4 large shows that we all consume. I feel like there might just be like 100 smaller shows on YouTube channels, on Netflixes or whatever. And so while I am like, I do know that like a lot of people want to get TV deals, I don't know that it'll be just like what TV deals used to be 10 years ago.
I completely agree with you 1000%. And I really agree with this idea of having, you know, a bunch of, I want to say quote unquote smaller influencers, if you will, or people who take up the space, if you will. But I also see this in podcasting already because, you know, if you think about even just over the last few years, I mean, I'm relatively new to the production space. If you look at, you know, my show didn't start until the end of 2018, beginning of 2019. That's not 2012. You know what I mean? Like that's still like, there are a lot of creators that started before me. And it's interesting because in that time, the boom of podcasting is insane. And so when you have so many people who are, you know, who are creating podcasts and creating, you know, episode after episode, I honestly almost makes me think that like if your podcast gets 100 downloads an episode, I feel like that's almost equivalent to like a few years ago you getting like 250 or 3. Like I don't know if that's like factual or like what the stats are behind that, but what do you think about that?
1000% agree. Like I definitely think that like because like I think the market's becoming a little more saturated, and I'm not like the person that feels like there's too many people, let's stop.
No.
I think there's still a big
I'm like, everyone come on down.
Yeah. And so I do agree with that though, that like if you look at like there's an amazing article that was written about like a guy that was featured in Apple's New and Noteworthy, like maybe 2012, like super, super early. I don't remember if that's the right date, but it was like at least like 6 or 7 years ago. And the impact in which it said like Apple being on Apple's New and Noteworthy jumped his like podcast downloads was insane. It was like, I think it might've been like a few 100,000 like downloads like instantly. And so I certainly think that that's not like the case anymore if you are featured in like Apple's New and Noteworthy now. And so I do agree with you from that perspective that like, I just think like the context of like having 100 downloads now versus 100 downloads, you know, 3 years ago or maybe even 10 years ago is completely different.
That's so true. I'm going to say something that maybe most people won't agree with, but I actually don't think that the New and Noteworthy, like it's cool and all that, but that's never like when we launch a podcast, like we don't even look at that. Like it's something that's like so far gone beyond, you know what I mean? Because first of all, you have platforms like Spotify now, and Spotify like really is just up in the game all around, in my opinion. And at the same time, I kind of feel like, you know, when people go and look for podcasts, they're searching in keywords of things that they want to watch. And so people, I don't know if a lot of people scroll New and Noteworthy. I don't remember the last time I even looked in that section. Like I open a podcast and I'm either typing someone's name or I want to learn about a particular topic. And that's it.
Yeah. 1000%. I hear you 1000%.
Do you agree with me is the question. No, I'm just kidding. Is this where we fight? No,
I know, right? Exactly. This is the argument. Yes. I know of a person whose name I won't say on this show.
Okay.
Well, I don't know them like personally, but they
I was like, do we know them together? Like, do we know them together? No, I'm just kidding.
I don't think you know though.
Okay.
But like if they're a pretty big podcast, so maybe you do. We'll talk about it offline. But this person happened to be featured in like New and Noteworthy, like maybe like 1 or 2 years ago, a few years back. And I feel like their podcast is now really, really big. And if I had to track and correlate like when it got big, I would say that it was synonymous with when they were featured in Apple's like New and Noteworthy. And it was like a pretty prominent feature as well in New and Noteworthy. So I know there's like different categories of features. So there's actually just like some podcasts that like Apple will work with like one-on-one. They get like a premiere spot. And then there's others that are just like featured in an appropriate category on like their editorial page. So it is like, I'm always curious to sort of like the impact that has for different people.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I would be curious to see how it would impact today also.
Yeah, 1000%.
You know?
And I feel like I'm comfortable talking about this because I was featured in New and Noteworthy maybe like February. Yeah, February.
Oh, after I just like
feel like
backhand did not compliment New and Noteworthy.
No. I do feel like it helped. Like I did see a spike in my downloads. I think maybe what I would do, I feel like my podcast is already pretty niche. And so I feel like I did see like a small drop off in some of those downloads. So I feel like people will see like my artwork, say like, oh, this looks cool, check it out.
Yeah.
I also feel like it's not general enough that like anyone could check it out. So maybe a small percentage of the people that actually saw it watched. And so if I still got a spike after that, then, you know.
That's such a good point. That's a really good point. I want to shift for a second into this content creation side specifically. I want to talk about some things that like, you know, when it comes to creating content that people can do, that creators can do to help make it a little bit easier for them. Like when you're creating, you create a lot of content, you have brand deals, you know, all kinds of stuff, which we're going to talk about in the next episode. But when you're creating content and you're coming up with ideas, like how do you even begin? Where do you even decide where you want to start?
Yeah. So I go back and forth on like two ways of creating content. And there's really maybe like three different categories that I create in. Okay. The first is just like the brand deal. So like these, like I absolutely have to do, like I don't have a choice. And so that's like one way I know that like, hey, on this given month, I am going to create these 10 videos because I've been paid and I have to release them this week, this month. I mean, so that's how I know. The second batch are just things that I know like are happening in the industry. And so I know like, oh, I have to make content about that thing. So for example, I knew that like, hey, Apple's like WWDC event is coming up. They're probably going to have some podcast updates. So I know that like in June, I'm going to be talking about that. And so I might know that like, hey, these 6 videos are things going on in the industry that I need to talk about. And then the last category is just sort of like inspiration. So I try and like have a system for creativity, which is just that like, if I get an idea, I need to be able to document it somewhere so that I can write a script for it and film it later. And so just having that system and that workflow makes it easy for me that when I do get ideas, wherever I am, I can like write it down, store it, and write it. Versus before, I would constantly get amazing ideas, but because I didn't have a system to document those ideas, they just kind of fell through the cracks. And I'd be like, oh man, I had a good idea, but like I can't remember it. I don't remember it anymore. And so like having that system is so important. And so right now, if I like opened my monday.com, which is where I keep all my stuff, you might see like 20 or 30 different like TikTok ideas. And so at any given point, I could just look at the ones that already have a script and just pick one and record it. And so just having that system and that workflow makes it easy to create content. That's probably the biggest advice I'd give is like, make it as like lower the barrier as easy as much as possible to like create content. And so like with this setup now, my camera is here. It doesn't ever move. My mic is here. It doesn't ever move. So if I wanted to, I could just sit down, light, record, and I'm already like rolling. Yeah. Versus like most people have to like get their tripod, find a location, get the lighting right. And it's just like, it's a lot of crap and it makes you less likely to create content.
That's so true. I feel like for myself, I get a little bit stressed out sometimes because my stuff is set up all the time. My camera's always set up. My mic is always set up. Like there's genuinely like no reason why. But I like to shoot stuff off my phone because I like how much easier it is for me to go and edit it, especially if it's something that's more time sensitive. Because if we look at like category number 2 that you were just talking about, some of those updates are things that are a little bit more time sensitive and they're things that you want to get ahead on. And you don't necessarily know what they're going to be until it kind of gets released, you know?
Yep.
But you want to be one of the first people who are going to report on it or talk about it. And so sometimes it's going to have to be on your phone, you know?
Yep. 1000%.
Right? And so it's kind of like, do you just record stuff off of your phone if it's going to be something like that? Or do you like prefer to like wait a little bit and then come back to like your setup and like do it the way that you would probably want to?
No, like always like on phone. And the faster and sooner you can record, the more there's like I don't know what the word is for this, but the more in real time that like video is. So for example, if I like,
timely.
it's like timely, and it's like, there's like an aura and an energy that goes with that. So for instance, like when I heard about the Apple has this new update where like, I think next month, no, it's in September, maybe, basically we'll be able to update every single thumbnail for each episode, not just have a thumbnail for our podcast. So we'll now be able to like use similar to YouTube basically. And so like when I first heard that update, I was like, oh, this is so cool. This is like amazing. Like I totally get why this is like awesome. I just read an amazing blog about it. I was like genuinely excited about it. Me recording like a video in that present moment without my microphone and only my cell phone, I think still would have been better than me trying to like come home and like reproduce that same excitement and energy. It's just like people could kind of tell that like you're excited in that present moment. And so I think the sooner you can record by any means necessary, the better, in my opinion.
I love that. I think that's super, super great. Now, would you say then it's okay to sacrifice a little bit of quality to make sure that you deliver the message?
I would give you advice that I don't always take, which is that like quality is not that important.
Like, okay, but do you think quality is important for a podcast?
I don't.
Really?
I know. Controversial thought.
What?
I know.
Okay, we disagree. This is the part we disagree. I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. Yeah. I want to hear why. Tell me why.
I think like it does, like, I think like if we're just talking about audio quality, I think it needs to be like legible enough that I could hear what you're actually saying.
Yeah.
But I think if you listen to a podcast like How I Built This, or even like a podcast called 20 Hertz, which just has like beautiful sound design. I mean, they have like multiple full-time employees whose entire job is just to make sure this sounds good. I don't think that level of audio is required for most podcasts. And I think that like for most podcasts, the bare minimum will work.
It's okay. It's true. It's true. Now, what if it's a video podcast?
Oh, even more so. Like, I think like video quality, in my opinion, is like the least most important thing that people care about.
Really?
Like, I'd say people, even on like TikTok, studies show that people care more about audio on TikTok than video.
Not surprised. I'm not surprised to hear that. I actually had Kim on my podcast and we did an entire series about private feed, like podcasts, and those are all audio based. And we talked a little bit about audio and like the importance of that. And it's true. Like if you can't hear, like and this is exactly the conversation we had, was the video doesn't necessarily matter but the audio always has to be good.
Yeah.
If the audio is shitty, and I mean, sometimes things happen and it is what it is. And I feel like, listeners are a little bit more forgiving, especially like people who come back week after week to listen to your stuff. But, if you, I digress. There's so many different ways I could take this conversation.
I agree. And I will say too, like, I feel like if you're watching a video or something and the video is like blurry and the person's like dropping the camera, but you can hear what they're saying and see what's going on, you're more likely to keep listening than if the video is clear, but there's like drilling and construction in the background and you can't hear.
And you're like, what did you say? Like, what are you talking about? But you know what? It's actually so true. Because I was doing a podcast interview once on my Happiness Happens podcast. And the guy that I was interviewing he was so amazing. The conversation was so good. And then halfway through, he had like his window was open, and I guess people were cutting grass or something near. He's like, what the heck? Like he literally stopped the record. He's like, I can't. He's like, you're gonna be able to hear it. And I was like, fair enough. And I'm so glad that he did, because all you would have heard was the lawnmower in the background afterwards. And I was like, no. Yeah,
that's such a great point. And I do think though that like with video, I think that like for most like video is such a weird thing, because I think that like even just like on most platforms, they already reduce the quality of like your video. So even if I were to record like a 4K video, most platforms are going to suppress it to 1080p, which is like the version below that. So it's just like, I think it's like the least important thing. And I think it's more important that we just like put out content as regularly and as often as frequently as we can.
I agree with you. I agree with you. And I've seen this. So one of my clients, we were in studio and something happened to like the video footage where most of it was blurry, and the podcast, like the season still did really, really, really well. Wow. And I don't think that the video quality, like maybe on YouTube, it wasn't as great, but at the same time, like one of the videos just completely blew up. Yeah. And so it's like people, again, are here for the message,
Yeah. Kudos to your client, because I feel like a lot of people just wouldn't have put out that content, but like we should be putting out that content.
I told her. I said, just put it out. Just put it out. You got nothing to lose. You know what I mean? Like you really, really don't. And like, I feel like it's really important to just like you got to be consistent, you know? And I think that's like a big piece when you're thinking about creating content. You can do, and so this kind of ties into what we were talking about in the first episode, when you have your growth strategy and you have your growth plan and all this stuff that you're doing behind the scenes to create, you know, traction for your show, you can put out your I'll go again with the primary content first, and you can do secondary content as well. That primary content, you have it on a schedule, let's say, but that secondary content is so important to be consistent with. All of it is important to be consistent with, but I think that secondary stuff is honestly, in my opinion, most important.
I would agree with that. I think people want to see you come and say like, hey, here's why you should listen to this episode, or here's a quote I selected. So I completely agree with that. I do feel like I do understand why people don't always feel comfortable publishing their stuff or like put barriers, because I feel like for example, sometimes people hire me as a consultant to like help them with like their social clips or their podcast clips or whatever. And most of the ways they reach out is because they see my social clips and they say like, oh, this looks really, really good. Can you create that for me? And so I kind of tell myself this lie, which is that like, well, I need to invest the max amount to have good clips because it's like a lead generator that people look at this and use this as my portfolio. And so when I have like work that's not that great, I just don't put it out because I feel like this is like my portfolio. And I think we all do that. Like we all think that like our excuse is like important enough and valid enough for us not to put out content if it's not great quality for whatever excuse we make up that's unique to us. And that's an example of like my excuse, but I think like people do that like just across the board.
I completely agree with you. My excuse is that I never get ready in the morning because, like, I mean, I do a lot of stuff behind the scenes. Like, I never wear makeup anymore. I get dressed, but like, you know, it's usually like Lulu's and like something else, like a sweater. You know what I mean? Which is very different than how I used to show up on camera. And so for like a long time, I was like, man, like I don't really want to show up on camera because I don't like the way that I look on camera. Do you know what I mean? And I'm just like, why would I go and create all this content? You know, my hair is greasy, it's in a bun, it's this, it's that, like all these excuses. And I had someone say to me once, he's like one of my like mentors, and he's like, it doesn't matter. He's like, it really does not matter. People do not care. And I was like, okay, well, don't tell me that because now I'm just going to roll in like pajamas. No, I'm just kidding.
Right. I'm going to take it to the extreme.
Yeah, exactly. But he had a point though, you know, because it doesn't actually matter at the end of the day. As long as you're putting it out there. I want to ask you really quick, before we wrap up this episode today, I want to ask you, do you have any tips for creators when it comes to shooting content, when it comes to recording content? You know, for myself, for example, I mean, I have a DSLR camera that I record this podcast off of. I find that such a pain in the butt to try and shoot content off of. Do you think it's just best to just keep it simple and just do it?
That's such a great point. I'm first of all very like anti-camera. That's just like the first thing. Like that's been like my thing since the very beginning. The irony of all of that is like I just got a camera 2 days ago, but I'm still very much like professional camera. Like I'm all for like cell phone. And I think with the way like the direction things are going, I think like for most people the iPhone is better than a camera, primarily because like the actual tool you're using is not that important. It's like how much you know how to use it that really makes a difference. And so for instance, it's like for most people, because it's easier to figure out all of the features on like the iPhone camera, on your sound with the iPhone, you're probably more likely to get like higher quality on like your cell phone than you are a camera, just because most people aren't going to know how to use it. Case in point, me. So iPhone is always like the way to go. And I think the only other advice I'd give to like creators is just like make your setup as easy as humanly possible, and then ask yourself realistically, what is like the max number of videos I could put out per day, and do that. Because I think that like whether you do one video per day for 90 days or you do 3 videos a day for 3 months, I think the outcome is the exact same. I just think you learn, like each video you put out, you're going to learn how to get better. You're going to learn something new about yourself. Whether you choose to do that over like 90 days, a year, or like a month, it really doesn't matter. It just matters that like you're doing it.
I love that. No, that's so key. I've noticed that with my own content too. Like when I actually show up and I'm actually consistent and I actually post my content. The other thing too, this is the most ridiculous reason to not post content. Are you ready for this? I have the content created and I just don't open my Instagram and post it. Just take that in. Like I literally have the content. It's right there. I'm scrolling and I'm on there. And I'm not posting the content.
Just curious, like though, like why don't you though? Just curious.
Honestly, I don't even think that this answer is like, it's ridiculous when you say it out loud, because I have to go into a different app to pull the content out of the app with the caption and format it and then post it. That's literally why.
But like why? Like why do you have to do that?
Because that's where it lives, because my team creates it and we leave. We have,
okay, I get you.
We have everything in Trello. That's why.
Got it. So, but I, like I feel like I don't know that I believe this. This seems like there's something else here.
I don't. That's a really good question. Ooh, that's a good question. It could be a little bit of like a, why bother posting it? Will it make a difference? Will it matter?
From like, okay. But like, not from like a quality standpoint, more so just sort of like, who cares?
Yeah, exactly. Okay. I'm like, is what I'm saying, does it have value? Like, is there a point in me posting it? Will people care if I post it?
Is this like content that's like recorded, like it's talking head and you're talking, or is it like podcast clips?
Both.
Okay.
Especially the podcast clips, because the person who does them for me, his name's Gianni and he's amazing. And he does such a great job. He always does a great job. But I'm always just like, I don't know. I that's a really good question. I just get this like a little bit of imposter syndrome, I think.
Sure. And I don't think that in itself is like that unnormal. I think a lot of people, including like myself, feel that way. I think what I've just been trying to figure out like these last few weeks is like why we feel that way. So same with me, right? Like I'll do all this work, capture all this content, get all the podcast clips, get them edited, but then I just won't want to post them. Sometimes I've like figured out that it's just that like I think that the clip in itself, the podcast clip, will not be that significant. That people will just see it and kind of like not care. And to me, I kind of feel like I want everything I post to feel like, yes, this was such like a great video. Like Lloyd always does great content. Yes. And some of that content, to be quite frank, is just not that good. And I hesitate specifically when that is the case, when I feel like, is it like great? Probably not. Is it like, okay, sure. And so that's one reason, but I'm sure there's like multiple reasons.
Okay, this resonates a lot with me. And I'm also going to tell you something because, okay, so I mean, you and I obviously knew each other. We've known each other for a while. We don't always get to talk though all the time, but I will tell you this. Your content is always great. Everything you post, I love. It's not even the words that you're saying, it's who you are as a human being. Like you have this really amazing energy to you, and you have a really great way of communicating and being relatable and seeing people, which is, I feel, really, really important. And I think that comes through in your content because you're not trying to be anyone else other than who you are. Ooh, I give myself goosebumps. Sorry about that.
Wow. I really, really, really appreciate that and really needed to hear that. I think sometimes being a creator, I think is a very lonely journey. And I think most times you don't know like how your content is like impacting people or performing outside of the metrics you're seeing of your content. And so I think like that really means a lot to me, and I really appreciate that.
You're welcome. You're welcome. It's genuine and it's honest and it's true. And it's what I was thinking when I was watching some of your stuff, and I was like, oh my God. I was like, he's so good. I was like, I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, he's amazing. I'm like, no wonder he has all these brand deals, because it just makes sense. You know what I mean? And so I guess maybe that's a lesson in of itself too. Like you and I play in the same space, you know what I mean? And it's like everyone brings something amazing to the table, and it doesn't really matter what you do, how you do it, like whatever. I think being true to who you are as a human being is so important. And I think also knowing that, you know, everyone struggles, especially creating content, like everyone's struggling, you know?
Yeah, that's such a great point. I love that so much. And I think I was having coffee with like a really big creator that I admire, or rather someone like on their team. Yeah. And I was just talking about like how chaotic things feel and how things feel a bit hectic. And I can't wait till I'm like bigger and I have a team so that it doesn't have to feel like this. And he was like, oh, dude, like we feel the exact same way. It's
I was just about to say, I've got a team that still feels hectic.
And it was maybe the first time I realized, I'm like, what do you mean you still feel that way? You're like, you're rich. Why? You have a team. Like, why would you feel that way? And it's just like, we all struggle with like the same things. And
I will caveat this too, and maybe we wrap up here too. First of all, I agree with you fully. Second of all, it's kind of like more money, more problems. You know what I mean? Like the more money you make, the more problems you have, the more this you have. Like it's more about like nothing is ever going to feel fully enough.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And when you get to the place when you're going to need a bigger team, you're going to very quickly realize you need a bigger team. You know what I mean? And you're going to have even more responsibility, even more brand deals. You're going to have videos that you don't want to create in moments you don't want to create them, but you have to.
Yeah.
So there's always like, and so it's almost like it's so easy to like look outside and be like, okay, everybody else is doing all these different things, but it's like, man, there's always something. I have a team of 5 and I don't put out consistent video the way that you do. You know what I mean? It comes down to how you want to show up. Which after 1000%. Today, I will be showing up.
You know what? Like I will say that's like one thing I'm really good at. I'm a great accountability partner. I'm glad you told me that. I will be following up with you.
Okay.
I'm very excited for you, and I feel like we are all on the same journey. So like when we like now that I know this, it's like next time I'll be like, I haven't seen you post any videos.
You're like, where are you?
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Oh, okay. Are you ready to talk about brand deals?
I am so ready.
Okay. Let's do it.
Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode on As It Relates to Podcasting. I know this conversation was super valuable for you, and I want to hear from you. So if you loved all we shared, please be sure to leave a 5-star rating and a review of the podcast where you're listening. You can do that on either on Apple Podcasts or you can leave a rating on Spotify. I would be so grateful. All of the links are in the show notes below and links to connect with both of us as well. So be sure to reach out, say hello, let us know if this conversation impacted you in any which way. And I am grateful for you. Thanks again for being here, and I will see you on the next one.